Hello there, John Kuturillo here, the life coach of your listener. Thank you for joining us for this episode. Today it's my pleasure to welcome Damien Stewart, the psychologist of Room 23 Psychology, to my program. I contacted Damien after I read an article that he wrote regarding the issue of working with clients who espouse or discuss conspiracy theories in the cultural sense. And I was interested to discuss that particular topic with him. Grateful to be able to talk to him today. As usual, I'll make clear that this is not advisory in any way. If you have any concerns about yourself or anyone else, what you see on the internet is not a substitute for professional advice, so please do not take what we discuss as advice. And please also don't interpret it as any kind of dictation of what worldview you should take or denigration of particular worldviews. Today we're discussing ideas to instigate conversation and to instigate critical thinking. This is not about placing moral value on particular worldviews or on particular people, so please bear that in mind as we discuss this topic. Damien, thank you so much for coming on the program today. It's good to see you. How are you?
Very well, thanks for having me.
My pleasure. Damien, tell us about Room 23 Psychology.
I've been in private practice as a psychologist for about 10 years, ever since I graduated from university. So I am a fully qualified sport and exercise psychologist, and also currently the National Chair of the College of Sport and Exercise Psychology through the Australian Psychological Society. But I do, mostly if I'm working with athletes, I'm probably more interested in the clinical side of things, mental health and well-being, and also working in some performance psychology as well. But I'm probably entered the in the field as being known as working with chronic pain and injury, whether it's injury in sport, whether it's workplace injury, car accidents, etc. But having been a police officer for 20 years, I now work with a lot of police officers as well. So, whether it's trauma, whether it's working with pain, whether it's working with relationship issues, a great deal of my clientele are police officers.
Excellent. That's a fantastic array of experiences that you've had, and no doubt in the course of practice you will encounter a number of different types of clients with a lot of different types of stories to tell. We're going to be talking about one particular type of client that you've described in an article referenced, and it's the idea of a conspiracy theorist client. The therapy space is quite a vulnerable one, because even though we as therapists and me as a life coach and a former social worker have a lot of training under our belt on how to remain objective and how to be able to interact with different types of people and evaluate the situation only based on the facts and not let our personal beliefs interfere with how we help people. But at the end of the day, we are still human, and we should know better than anyone, given our training, that it's so easy for beliefs that we have to seep their way into our interactions with people. So it really is quite a vulnerable space, isn't it, for people to be in, where we have so much control of the situation and we have to be extra cautious.
Yeah, and we as the therapist or the person as the life coach or the social worker, we're not invulnerable to being hurt, being angry, to have our values challenged as well. But yes, absolutely, the client feels that tenfold, to what we feel. Although most of the time, I must confess that it's an extremely positive interaction.
Indeed, I've had the same experience. Most of my interactions have been positive, and on a number of occasions, something that I've seen in a client has certainly led me to reflect on myself, and I think we as therapists become all the wiser for the different stories that we hear from the people we serve. You made an interesting point in the article about conspiracy theories in general, suggesting that at one time they were almost a source of comical entertainment for people because they had so little prominence in our culture that people tended to treat them as a point of discussion in a relatively light-hearted fashion. And then with the occurrences that have actualized in perhaps the last few years, especially with the COVID-19 pandemic, they became a lot more prominent. And it was suggested that these were becoming more dangerous because more people were potentially taking them seriously. Do you think that the danger of it means that they tended to be irrational in the first place, and that the only reason they're becoming dangerous now is because people are taking what we consider to be irrational beliefs more seriously?
Yeah, I think yes, they are, but also I think we can point to a number of examples by now where the conspiracy theories actually became deadly. Whether, depending on the audience that's listening to this, depending on what we say, we might be cast aside in what we're talking about just because the people don't agree with what we're saying, for example, so they will switch off. But, we had, with the QAnon conspiracy theory, we had a man turn up to a pizza parlor with an automatic rifle, aiming to shoot people to save children that weren't there, right? I mean, the biggest victim of that ended up being the man himself when he found out that there were no children at the pizza place being having their blood drunk and et cetera, and he's the one that ends up in prison. We ended up with six people killed, west of Brisbane. It was about 18 months ago when a conspiracy theory thought that the police were coming to get them when the police were really going there because they'd had a missing persons report and were trying to find the person that was missing. And 2 police officers, a neighbour, and the 3 offenders all died as a result of that conspiracy theory. You introduced the topic by talking about recency, but whether it's conspiracy theories or cult-like behaviour as well, like there's 2 great documentaries on Netflix at the moment, one about Jonestown, the mass suicide at Jonestown, or the, Waco, Texas. These are people that have beliefs that have led to mass killings. Sometimes now we're not talking about something that's fringe and something to have fun with, like the JFK assassination or landing on the moon, for example. We're talking about beliefs that are leading to people being killed. So, whilst we might have a chuckle about some of them, they're life and death. They're not something to be made fun of anymore.
Indeed. You've raised an interesting point about the effects that having the beliefs themselves can have on people's behaviour. I'm wondering whether there's a spectrum of different behaviours that people can exhibit in response to a particular belief. Let's say 2 people believe that the police are trying to enact a conspiracy to harm children, but let's call it a hypothetical belief. 2 people might have that exact same belief, but they might choose to act on it in separate ways. So, for example, one person might believe it's true, but they might choose not to try to kill police or try to kill people who support police because they believe that violence would be an equally bad act. They may simply choose to voice their opinions. Another person might think to themselves, if the police are trying to harm children, I'd better kill them before they get to those children. And then they might use that as a reason and see themselves justified in going to kill police officers. But I'm wondering if there's something else that influenced whether both of those people decided to enact those particular behaviours. I'm guessing there must be something very different about the person who chose to use violence than there is to the person who chose to just voice their opinions.
Yeah, I think that it's probably a very long conversation to get to that. I mean, I guess it comes down to personality. I guess it comes down to, life experiences. Have people had, are they prone to violence? Are people grown up in a violent situation? Is one person taught that, like you said, violence is unacceptable and so we don't enter into that kind of violence? And does the other person, have they found in their lifetime that violence is the only way to solve a problem, or do people have, like you talked about before, about the levels of tolerance of therapists? Do some people have a level of tolerance to at one, below this level, violence isn't a thing, but I tip over into a violent situation? I think that, with a lot of these issues that we've been talking about so far, there was always a point that these people that enacted the violence had not enacted violence. And sort of, got tipped over into a point where violence seemed to be the only option. So there probably is a scale on which, some people get tipped over here, some people get tipped over here, some people get tipped over there. That's probably how I'd answer that question.
Perhaps the question that I've had on my mind for a long time and may continue to have until the end of time, perhaps it's a question that we'll never be able to answer, seeing as we are trying to learn more about how the mind works every day, is to what extent should we hold people accountable and to what extent should we hold the spread of information accountable? When we limit the spread of information or we limit sharing of ideas, we're potentially setting a precedent that other information that perhaps deserves to be shared in some way would also get censored, and it's something that I've expressed in my own podcast, in my episode on freedom of speech and the slippery slope and how that works. So in summary, should we hold people accountable for their actions and let information be spread, even if it does seem rather unorthodox to us? In essence, to say, you can hear any information you want, but you're responsible for what you do with it. And if you enact violence, then there's no one else you can blame except yourself.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you. I practice existential psychotherapy, and, one of the great tenets of existentialism is the freedom to choose. And, along with that great freedom that we all have in our lives to make choices for what we do for ourselves, we must accept that comes with a great deal of responsibility, and we become responsible for the choices that we make. I think it ultimately is the behaviour that needs to be punished. We're talking about behaviour that crosses a line that is criminal, for example. But, the information flow, that's the big question, isn't it? We saw during the pandemic difficulties with freedom of speech. People were starting to get out there and say what they felt like saying without evidence. What I've found in society at the moment is that, and I think more so in the American landscape, is people are really getting into tribes when it comes to their politics. Left-wing politics, right-wing politics, and those politics seem to be moving further and further towards the extremes on both sides over a period of time, and people are aligning themselves with a tribe, as it were, and I must believe what the tribe believes, and so therefore, with each tribe is becoming news outlets or information sources that align with those extremes of politics, and on both sides we can point to evidence that some of us that may be a little bit more in the middle might say is without finding or without fact, without truth, but it's something that people have chosen to believe in, so they must believe it. Now, the question you're posing is, what do we do about that? One way is to let the information flow and come what may. The other side of that argument is to curtail that information, stop that information, kick people off of social media platforms, which seems to be the problem in the first place, is social media. And do we hold social media companies accountable for what goes on their platforms? These are huge arguments. I listen to many podcasts that discuss this very issue regularly, and I, at the moment, have not come up with a firm answer. It seems more that we need the information to flow and allow people to make their own decisions, but then be held accountable for their choices. But other questions come up with what harm is being done in the meantime. What does it lead to? And then also a cutting back on those sources of information just leads to a strengthening of the theory or the belief or the conspiracy in the first place. And so, do we sometimes need alternative pieces of information to curtail that person's belief in something in the first place? But it seems to be that if somebody starts down a pathway to believing a certain information, does an algorithm keep pointing them to more of that information, for example, right? So maybe it's the process of the information getting out there that we have to think about, getting alternate points of view, getting the other side. Those of us that think that we think critically, tend to try and see both sides of an argument before we make our final decision. So, which way to go? Once again, on one side I say, I believe that people should be allowed to do what they want to be able to do as long as it doesn't hurt anybody else. We found some of that information has actually done harm to others. So what do we do with that? And the other side of me says, well, why do we want false information to get out into the community in the first place? And shouldn't society be responsible for that? So it's a really hard one for me. Why do you want someone to be allowed to be openly discriminatory on television or in social media? It's beyond my mind why we want to allow that. Yet freedom of speech and liberalism says that we should allow people to say that. But to what end?
Tribes, so to speak, are definitely bred through cognitive bias, and our need to feel secure leads us to seek information that confirms beliefs that are most palatable to us, or that are most convenient for us to believe, perhaps because they benefit us or they satisfy our busy minds. Cults tend to be about controlling large numbers of people for the benefit of the leader, and some conspiracy instigators might well do that. They might instigate beliefs in order to control people. But others, like the client that you mentioned in the article, might actually be believing these things because they care about the fate of other people and they don't want other people to come to harm. We could potentially say there are different types of people who believe these ideas for different reasons.
They believe them for their own ideas, but I still tend to think that some of these conspiracy theories definitely aligned with politics, particularly during the pandemic. So whilst there was not necessarily a charismatic leader leading everybody, there were people who were driving these ideas and, as more of a cult without leader. I mean, QAnon said there was this guy called Q that was running around, but nobody really knew who he was, for example. But these people, as I said, they're trying to make sense of the world, and they believe these things for very similar reasons to the rest of us. Like I wrote in the article, my particular client, I came to understand, really did care about people. I felt that he was misguided and misunderstood what was happening, but needed to make sense of the world. Like the fact that, he refused to get vaccinated, for example, because he thought that vaccines were harmful. So he didn't get vaccinated, but when he knew that I was vaccinated, he became caring towards me and worrying about harm to me. So, and we were both at a mindset of people being safe from the pandemic that was affecting so much of the world. So we both cared about the same thing. We just came at it from a different point of view. And yeah, it took a while to sort of realise that, but that was a fact,
I believe it's also quite a common situation to find that people become angry with those who have differing beliefs, and it can happen in any pocket of the human race. It happens across all facets of human life. Do you think that the reason people might get angry when they hear about conspiracy theories is that they believe that when someone believes a conspiracy theory that they might potentially do harm to other people, as has been done evidently?
The violence that comes with a conspiracy theory, I do tend to believe that is on the very extreme level. Obviously it's not happened very often. I think it's more that people get tired of it. The cognitive dissonance that comes with somebody saying something that is so unbelievable to that person, I think it becomes annoying more than anything. And I think that the belief in conspiratorial thinking can lead people to living a life that is not potentially what the rest of us would call is their best life, which doesn't necessarily mean violence. It might mean not leaving the house or, bringing up this conspiracy theory at every dinner table, at every Christmas, at every birthday, and then an argument ensues if you disagree with them. The potential for aberrant behaviour leads people to be quite annoyed, and people saying things that are so foreign, so difficult for the listener to hear, that I think this is more what the problem becomes. And then that person, as they slide down the rabbit hole, starts to enact behaviours that, once again, aren't necessarily dangerous to anybody in particular, including themselves, but the people around them start to feel extremely uncomfortable.
Perhaps the anger in that situation is a manifestation of that person's reaction of thinking, how can somebody possibly believe this?
Yeah, and it also grates on a strongly held value that the person holds. For example, let's say, the Australian government says we're not going to open up the country until 85% of the population is vaccinated, and every time you come across a person that's not vaccinated, could be holding us under the 85% mark, right? So we start to find that other person's behaviour is affecting our life directly. So it might be that, of course, just go and get vaccinated, for goodness sake. We want to open up the country. I want to be able to travel. I want to be able to go to the gym. For example, but no, I'm not getting vaccinated. No way. And there's more than 15% of us that won't be getting vaccinated. So I don't know what the government's going to do. So I think that kind of thing starts to create anger as well.
Certainly makes sense and explains why there can be so many feuds that occur, and that this has arguably happened throughout human history, that people will war about their beliefs because they believe they have irrefutable evidence that one person's actions are going to affect their liberty and vice versa, and so one person's liberty has to end where the other starts. If we use the contemporary left-right political spectrum, then the media tends to frame conspiracy theories as being aligned with right-wing politics from a cultural perspective. Would you say, though, that there are potentially also left-wing political beliefs that could be called conspiracy theories? Because to the best of my understanding, there are potentially left-wing arguments that could also be framed in a conspiratorial fashion. For example, if you were to interpret sociological arguments and structural arguments in a particular way, some could potentially call them conspiracy theories in some way.
Yeah, I think so. Once again, trying to learn about this phenomenon, the left, right, why some of these conspiracy theories tend to be more on the conservative side of the political spectrum. One thing I've learned is that the mainstream media, tends to be more liberal. Tends to be more progressive. We have laws against discrimination, for example. So discrimination doesn't necessarily get spoken about, in a way that's going to be discriminatory necessarily in the news. So there seems to be far more leniency for conspiracy theories on the left, or beliefs on the left, as there are to the right. And I think that, it'd be fair to say that where conspiracy theories have promulgated on the right, they've led to violence. I study the Holocaust very, very closely, and Hitler said that if a World War II starts out, the Jews will be blamed for it, even though he was the one that invades a country, and then says it's the Jews' fault. But on the left, I think that we're starting to see some conspiracy theories. A lot of people are protesting the war in Gaza. Those protesters tend to be more on the left side of politics, I believe, from what I can tell. And there's a lot of those anti-Semitic tropes that have been around for centuries, maybe thousands of years, are starting to come to the fore in the left, which is supposed to be the side of politics that is caring and inclusive. I think there are extremes on the left. What I dislike about it the most is that I think that whilst the left gets further left, the right gets further right, and we end up with potentially world leaders coming to power that are dangerous, because of one side driving the other without either being better or worse than the other.
Exactly. There are numerous examples of this type of thinking, but there have been arguments made in sociology, for example, that the prominence of tall buildings are a manifestation of patriarchy, because it's a manifestation of people's obsession with large objects, large, tall, powerful, imposing objects. But if somebody takes that to a more extreme sense, they might say, well, these tall buildings are so prominent, it must mean that the patriarchy is extremely prominent, and I need to do something about it. And I'm not going to say that anyone has specifically used tall buildings as a reason to go commit murder, but the line certainly has to be drawn if somebody were to say, well, I have irrefutable evidence that these tall buildings are proof of the patriarchy and I need to go do something about it, and then perhaps goes and enacts violence.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. I mean, although I've not heard that one, the patriarchy of the tall buildings, I'm not surprised by it. If you come out and say, well, I don't believe in that idea that tall buildings represent the patriarchy, then you're likely to be shut down. You're likely to be told, well, you only saying that because you are the patriarchy. You want the patriarchy to continue. I'm not saying it's right, I'm not saying it's wrong, but what I'm saying is that there doesn't seem to be room for debate about these topics.
So it's a sentiment that I also hold in terms of wanting to be careful from a number of perspectives, one of them being that all of us, no matter how educated we are, can make errors in judgment in the way we evaluate the world. What I try in general to give people the benefit of the doubt, and personally want to be exposed to as much information as possible, because the more we have, the more we can analyse. I want most of all to understand how people's minds work, not necessarily because I want to dictate how people should think, but because I might potentially learn something, and the rest of society might potentially learn something, even if they don't agree with even what most of people say. There may be something that each of us can teach another person. And most of all, I think asking questions is one of the most important things we can do, which is another point that the article raised, that often when a conspiracy theory manifests, it's from a perspective of the person who holds that particular opinion often puts forward their argument by asking a question. For example, don't you think it's strange that the media never says this or never exposes that? And in order to make an argument in a solid fashion, technically speaking, there does need to be declarative evidence. You need to be able to cite something that is as watertight as possible in being able to demonstrate that a particular idea is truthful. But there's a lot to be said for asking the questions in the way that's mentioned, because let's be honest, not all of us are scientifically literate, and a lot of people, members of the public, don't necessarily have access or can understand scientific evidence in the way that some others can. And a lot of people who, and this is something that I fear, not because I'm anti-science or because I hate people with different beliefs, but because I believe people are sometimes being misled, in that when people say trust the science, a lot of people trust it without actually understanding how science works or even reading the evidence for themselves. And so I think those people would do well to ask questions. You can still believe in science. You can still conclude that your decisions are based on trusting the science. That's a personal choice. But asking questions in those situations, I think, is one of the most valuable things people can do.
Yeah, absolutely. As someone who's currently doing a PhD and starting to present on the results of that PhD, you want to present them openly in, give presentations so that people can pick apart your research. If you want to put something on paper and potentially have it published, you need to be able to justify why you've said what you've said, right? So it shouldn't be just about here's the information, believe the science. It should be able to be backed up, right? When I give my presentations, I'm far more interested in presenting to people the conclusions of that research, I guess. Whereas, I gave a presentation on the 5th of June, and the first person to stand up after my presentation was to sort of pull my research apart a little bit and talk about the limitations of the research and the confounds within the research. Now, he was absolutely right on all of those things, because what I'm researching is intergenerational trauma and how, I won't spend hours talking about it, but how do you lock down that the trauma of my great-grandparent is leading to the problems that I'm having in my life right now? That's a very difficult thing to lock down, but we try to do it the best we possibly can. So, in his critique of my presentation and those sort of things, I needed to listen to that, which then therefore led to me saying, well, how can I explain that better next time? Or how do I get to the bottom of that? Or how can I do more investigation to try to plug that leak one way or the other? Not trying to firm up my argument, but, my argument becomes better if I can provide explanatory evidence for how I got there or how I didn't get there. So I think that, to answer your question, I think it's very important to be able to not just accept the what science says or an expert says, but anybody that's an expert in something should be quite happy to explain how they came to the ideas that they did, or the opinion that they did, or the conclusion that they did. If somebody starts to get angry and pushes you away because they're questioning your point of view, then you might want to start to think, well, why is that? Is there just not something behind? Is there no substance to that, for example? Or can we look a little bit deeper, and does it ring true from other sources, for example? I'll give you an example that's not necessarily from science, but I'm in Poland, and I have a great deal of interest in Polish World War II history, and run a tour business based on that history. And about probably 6 months ago, I get sent a video from somebody that I know who says, "Oh, look, Poland's going on a war footing. Look at all of this military movement in Warsaw." And I'm like, and I was in Warsaw.
Mm.
And it was from a conspiracy theory site that was trying to push the idea that the West was going to war with Russia and look at Poland, but it was actually video from the Poles getting ready for their annual military parade. They have their own
Right.
Anzac Day, right? So this was preparation for a parade that happens every year. But that information was taken, factual information, factual videos of military vehicles in the streets, and then given a different context for people to believe.
If only sometimes I wish that every question in life was as easily solvable as being able to be right in the middle of the situation and being able to see with one's own eyes exactly what is truthful in the world. Unfortunately, all of us have access to truth and evidence to demonstrate truth that other people don't. But out of all the facts that exist in the world, each person's only going to know for certain a small number of them. So sometimes we have to trust that other people are telling us the truth, but it's not always possible to do that.
Believe and confirm, I think, is the way of thinking about it. Listen and confirm. Listen and confirm.
I think every person has a belief that's not necessarily objectively true, but gives them a sense of comfort. I'm sure we all have rituals sometimes that potentially are irrational, but hopefully most of us don't come to any harm as a result of them. Not aligning with any particular political value, I think I've certainly come into contact with people who have espoused beliefs that I think are misguided, and my main concern isn't necessarily that I place any value judgment on them, but concern that if they keep believing those ideas, then they're going to hurt themselves. But sometimes it's hard to confront somebody when what you want is just in their best interest, for them to know what it is they're believing before they make too many rash decisions based on it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we're not getting frustrated with these people because for the sake of getting frustrated. It's obviously because we care. One of the things I've come to understand is if somebody wants to believe something, there is absolutely nothing you can say that is going to change their mind. The best thing that you can do is sit with them and wait until they're ready to come to their senses, for lack of a better term. I would never suggest that anybody agree with something that they don't agree with. Absolutely not. But you don't have to jump down the person's throat about it as well.
Indeed, I think treating someone with compassion when you don't necessarily agree with them, and especially if you believe that their beliefs are going to harm them, is potentially the only ethical way by which you can actually help someone change for the better, because you're providing them with a credible reason why they should change by not being militant in the way that you try to persuade them. It's a terribly risky business getting people to change because as sure as we are that someone else's beliefs are irrational, we also have to constantly ask ourselves, are we sure that the solutions that we have are actually objectively better, or are we potentially going to do just as much harm by convincing that person to change?
And even having this conversation, how do you and I, we seem to be aligned in our thinking. How do we know that we're right? I run this tour business trying to show people World War II and the Holocaust here in Poland. And I just spent 17 days with a man whose politics don't align with my own. But we got on extremely well. We spent 17 days driving around the country in a car together. And I kept a mindset of myself of curiosity. Here is a person that has beliefs that don't align with my own. But what can I learn from him? I really wanted to take the opportunity to learn why he believed what he believed. I wanted to understand what is it that makes somebody believe this or believe this or believe this. And by the end of it, I got the answer. Him and I could actually have a respectable debate in the car without each other harming each other, without disliking the other, without yelling, by just asking questions of each other, of remaining curious to the other. Once again, though, no matter who you're dealing with from a conspiracy point of view or a cult point of view, is that somewhere in there's agreement on something. And I think it's only through having that open mind that we start to be kinder to one another, right? It doesn't need to be a war.
Indeed, curiosity is something I try to discuss all the time as much as possible, because it's better to go through life constantly critically analysing information and not necessarily settling on any answers than it is to quickly settle on an answer and potentially being ill-supported and wrong, and then potentially leading you down a route that's not effective or potentially harmful. And having a critical mind is the best way. There, you can certainly have your own beliefs, but the less you demonise someone else for their beliefs, the more likely you are to learn something, even if you believe differently.
Jean-Paul Sartre said that when I choose for all mankind, right, or all humankind. And what he was saying is that my behaviour reflects what I believe in the world. So, as the example he gave is that because I do not want my bicycle stolen, I don't steal somebody else's bicycle, because the moment that I steal somebody else's bicycle, I'm saying that it's okay for people to do that to me. And most people wouldn't like that, because when we make these choices, we are ultimately indicating what we think is okay for humankind. And I think, getting back to what you're saying about thinking critically, the first place that we need to think critically is about ourselves.
Okay, Damien, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been a pleasure to have you.
Thank you very much for having me.
I'll restate that if you have concerns about yourself or anyone else, please seek professional advice. I'd also very much welcome contact from our audience. If you have any thoughts of your own, whether you agree with us or disagree with us, please write to me. I'd love to hear from you and potentially have you as a guest on future episodes of my program. I hope that we've inspired thought and critical thinking. And until next time, take care.